Let's get started. Um, uh, I just want to thank you for participating in this conversation. I really want to thank you for writing a really distinguished, eloquent, richly informed, profound, and thought-provoking essay for the inaugural issue of Sapir, which is, I hope people can see it, the journal I am holding in my hands. It is, I am the editor of Sapir, and this is a 4-volume effort being produced by the Maimonides Fund in collaboration with Jewish Insider. Our first issue, which came out in April, dealt with the subject of social justice. We had 14 essays on the subject. Yours was among a group of really distinguished essays from a wide variety of sources. I'm just going to say another word about the journal. It is subtitled A Journal of Jewish Conversations, and that is very much why you and I are having this conversation now, why we hope that later in this hour, we will be able to have a conversation, at least of sorts, through the chat function, the Q&A function, with some of the people on this call. This is not a right or a left-wing publication. It is really intended to bring in a broad Jewish audience and to explore and discuss a very wide variety of perspectives, not only theological or social, but also political. First issue, as I said, is on social justice. The next issue is going to be on the subject of power. Third issue is going to be about education, philanthropy, and subjects of Jewish continuity. And fourth issue, final issue, is, as they say, TBD. We're trying to figure that out. But I really think the quality of the essay speaks for itself. And I want to really dig in a little bit to your wonderful piece, which sort of formed the third part of a triptych. We asked Rabbi Shlomo Brody to talk about social justice as a biblical concept. Moshe Halbertal of Hebrew University, the great scholar, talked about social justice in its sort of medieval manifestations and versions. And then finally, you rounded out that section with social justice for moderns, thinking about this somewhat amorphous concept of social justice as it has evolved really with the emergence of the Jewish people from European ghettos, you might say, in the earlier middle parts of the 18th century, bringing it up really to Buber, Levinas, and really all the way to the present. And you start by saying that modernity is a balancing act for Jews between particularism and universalism. Just say a few more words about what you mean by that.
Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words and also for the invitation to write for Sapir, which was it was a great experience. And I hope that people will read the essays there. And I look forward to the volumes to come. What I meant by that was that in the Jewish tradition, there really has been, on the one hand, this pronouncement of the great universal value that all human beings are created in the image of God, that levels everyone. And there are sources, even in the Torah, where the prophet says, for example, it's true I brought you up out of Egypt, but I brought the Ethiopians from Kir. And so don't think that you're the only people that I have a relationship to. And that idea, this universalist idea, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, all of the pronouncements of the universality of humanity, that's a big part of the Jewish tradition. But at the same time, Judaism is distinguished by its sense of responsibility of Jews to one another. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh, all of Israel is responsible for one another. There's a very tight familial I would use the word tribal, but tribal has negative connotations. And I don't think this is a negative idea. There's a familial connection, which is to give a simple and beautiful example. So Sharansky, among others, points out that some Jews became universalists, right? And they became communists, and they ended up enslaving the Soviet Union. Some Jews stayed particularists. They tried to free Jews, and they ended up freeing the entire Soviet Union. And Cynthia Ozick puts this in a beautiful image. She says that the shofar has a broad end and a narrow end. If you start off blowing in the broad end, you get nothing. But if you start off blowing in the narrow end, you get a sound everyone can hear. So there's this interplay between particularism and universalism that constitutes the Jewish tradition.
And what you're suggesting, especially with that beautiful image from Cynthia, is that there isn't really a contradiction here. There is a chain, there's a kind of a natural progression. And it leads me to a question about concepts of loyalty in Jewish tradition, because one might say one of the oddities of social justice, I don't want to say for moderns, but as practiced by moderns, by us,
right,
is an idea that loyalty really, that to be a universal, right? To care for the universal means that our loyalty to the distant stranger, in fact, potentially takes precedence, or ought to take precedence, over the kinsman, right? And that's part of the modern social justice thinking, that what we really should animate us is what is happening, whether it was in the 70s in Cambodia, or the 80s in Ethiopia, or in the 90s in Yugoslavia, and so on, that the locus of our moral concern is best placed away from us, that there's a kind of a selfishness in saying that we ought to care first and foremost for the people who define our immediate circle, and that loyalty, like a stone in the water, is a series of concentric waves that diminishes as it expands. So talk to me a little bit about that kind of idea of how you balance that, the potential selfishness of a sense of loyalty that begins with your own, and then nonetheless has a universal, or fulfills a universalistic aspiration.
So to start off with, I mean, a sort of classic critique of the over zealousness of people for what is far away from them is in Dickens, where he has Mrs. Jellyby, who's always worried about what's going on in Africa while her own children are starving.
Yes.
And there is definitely a tendency, I think, among some, to assume that you prove your selflessness by not caring as much for the people who are close to you. And while I understand that on one level, of course, it's unproductive, because you have the greatest influence, of course, on those who are closest to you. But also, it is true that you have to balance severity and intimacy. That is, if somebody's in terrible, you mentioned the Cambodian genocide. So did we have a greater responsibility to the Cambodian genocide than maybe to attend the local city council meeting? You could argue yes, because the genocide is so much more severe than the argument over whether to put a stop sign up on your corner. But it is certainly true, and the best example is one's children, that the influence and the shaping possibility and the chance to create a good community is overwhelmingly concentrated on those who are close. And so the Torah gives this exact example. It's like, God can't create a perfect world. First, there's the flood, and then there's the Tower of Babel. And so God finally says, all right, I obviously can't do this with everyone. Let me see if I can just take the Jewish people and try to create something of them that can then be an example. So people are the same way. You have to first influence what is close. And if you can't do that, you're unlikely to influence what is far away. I'll just give you one more example that I remember years ago when I was studying the French Revolution, that Mirabeau, who was called the friend of man, after he died, his daughter said the friend of man was friend to neither wife nor child. Now, it's easier in some ways to be the friend of man than to be the friend of wife or child, but that's your greater responsibility.
one of the terms of art that is invariably invoked when talking about Jews and social justice is tikkun olam. But I also would wager that a great many Jews don't really understand what the concept is, how it has been practiced, and where it is rooted. Do you want to talk a little bit about tikkun olam?
So the two major sources of tikkun olam are one, in the Mishnah, where it does sometimes talk about how you should be kind to non-Jews or treat them properly for tikkun olam. That is, but part of it is for the reputation of the Jewish people, not just, I mean, it's also to make a better world. But the other part of it, and really where the richest imagery comes from, the idea of brokenness and repair, is actually the Kabbalistic idea of tikkun olam, which really speaks about repair within God. I mean, it's a deeply mystical notion. But Jews who have experienced so much of the brokenness of the world, you can understand why the idea appeals. The problem, as we've discussed before, is that it then gets repurposed to whatever cause you think is important. So saving the whales is tikkun olam, and integrating schools is tikkun olam, and whatever political agenda caption. Now, that doesn't mean they're unworthy political agendas. That's a separate question. But whatever political agenda becomes important to you, that's what Judaism says you ought to do, mipnei letaken olam, in order to fix the world. But remember that and the place that most Jews will be familiar with this, if they have any experience in services, is in the Aleinu, which talks about fixing the world under the kingdom of God at the end of the service. And that idea, the idea really is that you fix the world under the kingdom of God, that is through the mitzvot, through the Jewish tradition, and not necessarily through social or political action, although these days that's what the word has come to mean almost universally.
Its roots also, you mentioned, come from divorce laws, right? I mean, that's also, I mean, it's very
right. Yes, familiar. It's very specific. It is very specific. It comes originally in Gittin, right, in the Talmud, from divorce law. And you can understand that, like, olam, even though it means the universe, it really means the specific situation that you find yourself in, and the repair of the community. And this goes back again to the universal in particular, which is your community is also the world that you live in, as opposed to fixing the entire world.
You discuss Martin Buber in your essay, and his kind of concept of a kind of radical mutuality, which led him politically not only to returning to Germany after the Shoah, but also led him to become an advocate of a binational state.
Right.
That resonates with a lot of, at least the second part of it, resonates with not only, I don't know if it's a lot, but prominent younger American Jews who are deeply dismayed by the particularistic strains of Judaism, especially as they're embodied in a politically potent state of Israel, who want to see a Judaism that is about a kind of a radical recognition of the other,
yes.
And seems to, you know, in that sense, at least from a Buberian sense, kind of or draws a kind of intellectual and moral sustenance from Buber. Are they interpreting Buber correctly? And just how do you sort of describe the scale of his influence in terms of this question?
So there are so many threads to pull on here, but I would say they are interpreting Buber correctly, because Buber, like many deeply insightful interpersonal philosophers, and some people aren't going to like my saying this, I think Buber politically was very naive. I I admire, it's a naivete that I admire, but I'm glad he wasn't defense minister. Because interpersonally, Buber is extremely powerful, and theologically, Buber is extremely powerful. But like many people whose I would say, Buber's failing in some sense was that he did not believe in the continuity of deep evil and bad intention in other human beings. And that he did believe in the power of dialogue to overcome it. And a belief in the power of dialogue to overcome it is a beautiful thing. But unfortunately, as the history of the 20th century has shown us, it's not a successful political strategy. And so I feel the same way to some extent about the people who are binationalists. That is, the people that they talk to are also they're either on the same wavelength, or at least they can speak the same language. Those are not the people who are making the essential decisions about politics vis-a-vis Israel. Because we know that when it is possible, like when someone actually speaks that language and actually runs a government, they become Anwar Sadat and you get peace. But that hasn't been the experience of Israel by and large. The experience of Israel by and large has been that the deep hostility that people feel to them is not ameliorated by I-thou encounters.
So we're now, I mean, this is now, I have to be careful with my language. The stuff is getting real.
Yes, it is.
You had an essay just the other day in the New York Times. You were extensively quoted when it came to that horrific attack in West Hollywood on
Right.
those diners, those diners eating sushi, who identified as Jewish. And this was a group of people who were beating up other people in the name of a form of social justice, right? Freedom for Palestine, which seemed to travel in the same car as death to the Jews. So how is a young, I mean, now what, I really have no idea who's participating on Zoom, or their age profile, but let's imagine that at least some of the people listening to us are people, even teenagers or people in their 20s. They're socially aware. They're committed to a social justice vision for the United States that has an emphasis on equality and diversity or equity and diversity and inclusion. They want to be Jews who speak from a place of kind of moral, a certain kind of moral standing, right? And yet they're participating in a social justice movement that seems to have mixed feelings has negative feelings about Zionism and not entirely warm feelings about the Jews. How does a young Jew like that navigate the modern social justice landscape, or how ought they navigate it?
Well, I mean, you've put it really well, unsurprisingly. And I think for progressive Jews who believe in let's take the word Zionist out of it, such a loaded word, who believe in a Jewish state, okay, which is Zionist, but let's just leave the terminology out, who believe in a Jewish state, this is a very difficult time. It really is, because the people who believe as you do not make that, do not carve out the space for it. Now, there can be 26 Muslim states. That's okay. I don't hear any protests actually on the progressive wing about that, or 18 Christian states, again, no protest. But the idea that there should be a particularistic state for Jews for a whole variety of reasons, and I don't mean to get too polemical about this, strikes them as wrong, oppressive, colonialist, all the words that denote a bad person. I don't know how you, other than to say actually to have a state for the Jews in the Middle East that is a democracy and gives equal rights, LGBTQ, et cetera, that actually is a progressive value in a lot of ways, even though I disagree with many of the policies of the state. I think that that's a defensible position. It's just not a socially defensible position. It's intellectually defensible. But right now, it's really hard to be in those circles and to make alliances with such people. I mean, look, when Donna Brazil, who was clearly identified with the left, when she published an article against anti-Semitism, it appeared in your old paper in the Wall Street Journal. It did not appear in The Nation. It's like all defense of Jews right now and defense of Jewish causes and interests and so on is really difficult on the left. And I don't know how to revive that cause, but it's imperative, because I don't want Israel to be a partisan issue, and it is increasingly becoming a partisan issue, and that's a bad thing.
I think there are two broad approaches in terms of answering the question, right? And one approach is essentially to scream a little more loudly, look at us, we're social justice warriors too. Haven't you noticed that we have performed the following umpteen thousand social justice mitzvahs in the past several years, and always go a little farther in proving one's bona fides. On the other hand, I was having one of these conversations with one of your fellow authors in the first journal, Einat Wilf, who is a former labor member of Knesset. I was amused that in a story in the JTA, she was somehow described as some kind of right-winger. But she made the point that for many years she believed in all the things that the left believed. Two states, territorial concessions, making sacrifices and risks for peace, accepting the Palestinians as people with whom we have to share the land. And once that became the received wisdom, she didn't get any points for it. The demand simply became that much greater. And she calls this the pound of flesh strategy, which is that whenever you deliver a pound of flesh, well, another pound of flesh is demanded, until ultimately the pound of flesh is you have to sort of renounce Judaism or denounce your fellow Jews or stop believing everything that you used to be considered a core Jewish self-interest. So that's one strategy. And then the alternative is a reversion to particularism, right? I mean, it's kind of going back to, like, here's who we are, and maybe we're going to be hated for it. And so what I'd like to hear from you about is, how do you assess those strategies? And in particular, the second one, which is to say, this is clearly not our party. We're not welcomed here. Let's do something else. What's the more, I mean, you can tell I have an idea of what my answer is, but I'd like to hear what yours is.
So I have many, as you can imagine, I mean, my congregation, I have many members who every day bombard me with emails essentially making that case. This is not our party, we have to leave. And some on the other side, but increasingly fewer. And this is going to sound, un-Yeatsian, but I think the center has to hold. If the center doesn't hold, and what you have are the right that says the other party is completely invalid and inhospitable, and the left that says the other party are basically, fascistic colonialists, then what about those of us who actually believe that there are people of good intent on both sides, and that it still is possible to make progress with other human beings, even though it hasn't been done for a variety of reasons. I hear echoes of my previous accusation of Buber, that he was naive politically. Maybe I'm naive politically, But I actually don't believe in abandoning either wing of American politics. I think that that's a terrible mistake, and I want to try to raise up those voices on both sides that are supportive of an Israel that is the vision of Israel that I believe most of us share, which is a democratic, Jewish, humane, decent, and as liberal a place as it is possible to be in a very, very, very bad neighborhood. Because how you behave, there's in the Bible, when Lot sends his daughters out basically to be ravaged by the community, or is going to send his daughters out to do that, and the rabbis say, how could Lot do this? I mean, he grew up with Abraham, and their answer is, when you move into a bad neighborhood, your conduct changes. And it's very hard to be in a neighborhood where everybody wants to destroy you and constantly be open-handed.
So just judging from your perch in LA, your congregation, your sense of the Jewish community there, is there a center still that can hold? I mean, this is a question I ask myself all the time. I keep telling myself, no, really, if you just get off of Facebook and Twitter and you really notice what normal people think, you realize that the loudest voices aren't representative voices, that people really want a much more centered conversation. They're more balanced. This is a real constituency. They're here. It's just a matter of finding a way to turn that kind of centrist intuition into a more viable political or social program. It just hasn't happened. And then I stop and wonder, maybe I'm just fooling myself.
Right.
So what gives you hope that there is this center that actually can hold, both in Israel and here in the United States?
So they're two somewhat different questions. Look, if Bennett and Lapid form a government together, that, I suppose, if you balance that out, you've got a center. What gives me, I mean, first of all, one of the things that gives me hope is that I often get messages from people who say, look, I don't scream on social media, I don't talk on Facebook, so on, but I like what you say and I agree with this stuff or that stuff. That's true. The problem in part is the people who generally think centrist-y-ish, they're not the people who send around a billion articles and who, as you said, make the most noise. So it's very hard to gauge. And I nonetheless do believe that a lot of people, as the centers of gravity move, there are a lot of people who just aren't moving, but they're also not necessarily in the leadership or the most important voices.
One of the points, and this is a point that is made by one of the people asking questions, unfortunately anonymous, but lives in Canada, and is asking, where is this political center? And this is an interesting question. He or she says, I see much silence about hatred of Jews on the progressive left, but I've also seen demonizing on the right. But what I find interesting is you talk about the center, and one of the things that has happened, I think very distressingly, in the past month or so, is that the political center, which usually can be counted on to denounce acts of racism, horrors like the murder of George Floyd and so forth and so on, been kind of silent.
Yeah.
When it comes to one of the largest increases in anti-Semitic attacks, nakedly anti-Semitic attacks, that we witnessed in a long time. And so, speaking from the Jewish center, how do you talk to a non-Jewish center about what it is that we need as a community?
Yeah, I mean, it has not been completely silent. There have been some very encouraging statements. We had a pro-Israel service on a Friday night, and we had a Black preacher come and gave a beautiful statement about support for Israel, him and his community, and how much he appreciated Jewish support for the Black community. But yeah, there aren't enough statements like that. I certainly agree. And part of the reason, is this perception that Jews are all rich and privileged and white and therefore don't need support. And it's so ironic to think about Jewish history and that perception that is painful. Look, it is also, I want to just, I don't mean, as you know, I'm hopeful by nature. I don't do well with pessimism. It's not my, but this is the first time in my life that I've walked around, and I walk around Los Angeles with a kippah. It is the first time that I have at all ever wondered whether anything will happen to me as a result of that. And that's because there's a sort of creeping legitimation of hostile feelings towards Jews that is really worrisome. Now, I don't believe for a second, when people ask, could it happen here? I think absolutely not. It is not at all comparable to other places. And I have my simple reason why, this is my American exceptionalism answer. It's not because we're nicer people or because we have a constitution or any of that nonsense, because other places have that too. But in most of Jewish history, there were Germans and Jews. There were Russians and Jews. There were, Poles and Jews. But in America, there aren't Americans and Jews. There are lots and lots and lots of different groups. And therefore, there will be hostility sometimes towards different groups. It will get worse, it will get better. But it's not like there's an overwhelming majority that will then gang up on the Albanians or the Hindus or the Muslims or the Jews. So I'm not preaching America could be a second Holocaust, God forbid. But it could get worse. It is getting worse. And without, as you said, some serious sustained pushback, I don't see it getting that much better anytime soon.
Let me pick your brains. Let's imagine that a number of prominent philanthropists are listening in on this call and are capable of putting a lot of resources behind an idea for making it possible in America, or ensuring that in the United States, David Wolpe can walk anywhere he wants in LA or any other city wearing a kippah and never feeling threatened. What would those efforts look like? And would they be centered around the Jewish community or the non-Jewish community?
I think that the efforts would have to be what we've tried, but had a serious, sustained education about Jews, Judaism, and our place in history. Because the narrative, the story, is extraordinarily powerful in explaining who someone is and how they came to be the way they are. And that's one of the reasons, like, you see, I would say, whatever one thinks, whether it's terrible, whether it's wonderful, like the 1619 Project, the idea of it was, let's make the narrative different, because if the narrative is different, the people involved will be seen differently.
I love this. We need the 1619 BCE Project.
That's right, exactly. That's exactly right. I love that. That was, by the way, why I wrote that piece in the New York Times. It was because I wanted people to see that the Jewish story is a deep story in the land of Israel, which it clearly is. I remember, this is like a reverse thing, but I remember many years ago, I realized the power of narrative in one movie, which changed the way I thought about stories forever. It was Bertolucci's 1900, which was not one of his great movies, but in the opening scene,
some would disagree, but go ahead.
What's that?
Some would disagree, but
I know it became a cult movie, but I think it's not. Anyway, doesn't matter. That's a separate discussion. But in the opening scene, you see Donald Sutherland pursued by all these people with pitchforks, and you feel terrible for this poor guy who's getting killed by the villagers. And then at the end of the movie, you want to kill him yourself. And I realized how much your attitude towards somebody is a function of the story that you know about them. When you get to know somebody better, their story is different. And Jews, because we were intent on assimilation in America, we were not intent on telling America our story. We didn't want to. In fact, that was not We should just be good citizens. And I think that right now the opposite is needed.
Well, I mean, and it's true not only in terms of finding Hebrew inscriptions on pottery as you did as a young boy
Right.
in Israel, but it's also a question of telling the American Jewish story, because another fellow author in her piece, Pamela Peresky, writes about how the American Jew is seen by some as not just white but hyper white, right? That's the term she uses, quoting somebody. And there isn't a sense among, I mean, one of my fears is there isn't a sense among too many people, particularly in the social justice world or its vicinity, that understands that the American Jewish story is actually a story also of discrimination, suffering discrimination, of poverty, of dispossession, of consistent anti-Semitism in ways obvious and subtle and sometimes violent. And there's a connection between that story and what is, in some ways, what was happening on the streets of West Hollywood just a couple of weeks ago.
There's no question. I mean, when you see the anti-Semitic tropes that are now unfortunately taking hold in the Muslim world, a lot of them are anti-Semitic tropes from the Christian world in the Middle Ages, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This idea that Jews control the world, that's from a 19th century Russian forgery. So yeah, they're memes, to use is it outdated yet, that word? But they're sort of cultural memes that people need to know about. The problem is public education is a very uphill battle, as you know. Americans are not particularly worldly or historically literate, or aware of the world outside of America, which is both America's blessing and also one of its great deficiencies.
Although you make a point that I think is notable, especially in the context of California, which was that there was an ethnic studies curriculum being proposed that had a draft curriculum was sort of nakedly anti-Semitic, and the Jewish community, particularly in California, organized, I'm not sure, it remains to be seen quite how successfully, but really rose up against it. What are the lessons in that?
So one of the lessons is that you really can absolutely make a difference. The curriculum has been changed, will be changed. How much it will be changed and what the result will be, as you say, is uncertain. And I still get emails every day from parents who say, my kid learned this in school, the teacher said that in school. And so that's why I say it's pervasive, and it's really important to counter that. And yes, I do think actually a public education campaign is possible. We know those things can work. I mean, to take an example from left field, like smoking is a good example. There are campaigns that you can undertake where there can be a certain tipping point where people start to realize that actually this is not okay, or this is okay. I don't know how to design and create such a campaign, but we certainly presumably have the expertise to do it. It is also true that the instantaneousness of pictures and Twitter and so on don't help Jews tell a story. A story takes a little bit of time. You can't do it in a tweet.
Well, that's actually a very interesting and very important aspect of Judaism, which is a storytelling tradition, does not lend itself too easily to kind of coloring book types of images or 280 character tweets. I want to give our audience a little chance to offer some comments and send some questions your way. And I'll begin with Randy Skirka, first of the questions, which is what allies in Los Angeles have stepped forward to support the Jewish community in the face of blatant anti-Semitic hate crimes like the attack on the diners at the sushi restaurant? Can the root cause, the incitement to harm Jews, be identified and action taken by law enforcement there by way of criminal investigation?
Well, so first of all, yes, they did arrest the people, at least one of the people involved in the attack. And when we had, I want you to know that when we had our service that I mentioned before for Standing with Israel, Maher Hagopian, who was the, I assume, Armenian gentleman who came to the defense of the Jews and actually helped them fight off the attackers, he came to the service. And it was a beautiful moment. You should have seen people stand up and give him an ovation and how moving it was. And he said, look, I'm not a speaker. He said, I'm here because I'm a loyal friend. And it was just very moving. Some people have made individual statements. Some public officials have made statements. Some of the evangelical Christian community have made statements. But I don't want to say that there has been a deafening roar of support. There's been some support, but I don't think that people feel that an incident or two is yet at the kind of crisis point where they have to open their shutters and look out into the world. And that's part of the question that I think we do have to ask ourselves as well is how much do you say in reaction to how much? You know, if it's one person who throws a brick through a window, which is what happened at a kosher restaurant, and he also tried to do the same at a synagogue, is that just one person? And is it too much to create a whole narrative of anti-Semitism? If it's one assault at a restaurant and one brick through a window, is then that, at what point is the reaction commensurate with the problem? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise and keep rising. And so the point may be soon where this has to be a giant public outcry.
This is a question I want to make sure people know that we're not ducking the harder questions. I'm going to skip over a few others. Deborah Ruth asks, Jewish progressives or just progressives do not have a problem with the Jewish state. They have a problem with the displacement of the Palestinians. It's a statement, but it invites a comment.
So I think for some people that's true. I'm not sure that that's true for Jewish progressives in general, but I mean for progressives in general, excuse me. But I think for some people she's absolutely right. And in order to answer this adequately, I think we need a much longer conversation about what happened in the Middle East. But again, sorry for referring to Twitter, but I gave on Twitter a list that I pulled from somewhere of all the various peace offerings that Israel has made over the years. There would be an Arab capital in East Jerusalem right now if Arafat had accepted the offer, I think in 2003, but he didn't.
2000.
And when what's that?
2000.
2000, thank you. But when you make repeated offers and when they are rejected and the situation gets worse and worse and worse and worse, then you're right, it looks bad. But I don't think it looks bad because Israel doesn't want to live in peace.
So a related question, but worth sticking to the topic. My niece recently sent me a site called, I think she meant Decolonize Palestine. How do I respond to her? What do you recommend as the best credible sources for honest conversation, both about the promise and problems of Zionism?
So I actually think that I would say to her, are you willing to read a book, even if you disagree with it, and offer to do the same? And then send her maybe Noah Tishby's new book, because it's very easy reading. It's very clear. It will explain the history of the place and the conflict. It's not dogmatic. It's not blind. And it's called Israel, I think, a brief history of the most misunderstood country on earth. I think that's close to the title. There are lots of other books, but this one just came out and I think is a good one to give to people who really believe that basically the Jews came in, kicked out all the Palestinians, and now they won't let them back, which is unfortunately the mangled narrative that holds too much sway.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's extraordinary that line, decolonize Palestine, kind of quietly testifies to the amazing success of Israel's haters to precisely reverse the facts. I mean, we have, I think, as solid an archaeological record of the Jewish presence in what is mistakenly called Palestine,
right,
dating back several thousand years. That land has since been colonized by Romans. It was colonized by various caliphates. It was colonized by the Byzantines, the Ottomans. It was colonized by the British, and then it became Israel with a partition plan, which was rejected by the Arabs, who never sought to establish a Palestinian state in the 19 years in which they ruled the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. So, you know, part of the problem is that in the war of slogans, those who are sympathetic, like we are, to Israel have not done a particularly good job. This idea of decolonizing Palestine, I think, perfectly captures that. Let me move forward.
Okay.
Hannah Rothstein asks, do you think that the US is inextricably stuck with a two-party system that is increasingly polarized? Is it possible to create a third centrist party that supports the vision of Israel that Rabbi Wolpe just described? Being a vocal but party-affiliated centrist is increasingly frustrating. Hannah also adds, Brett, I still think that you and Frank Bruni should start a centrist third party. And I would just answer that quickly by saying that the only third party we would start, Frank and I, would be centered around cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. But do you want to?
So I actually, here's what, first of all, third parties classically, and Brett could answer this with much more expertise than I, have not been successful. The most successful attempt at a third party run in my lifetime was Ross Perot, and he still failed pretty considerably. But the other thing that I would say is, yes, we are increasingly polarized. And no, I don't see a way out of it, except that if you live long enough, you recognize that everything changes. And the fact that we're polarized today doesn't mean we'll be in 10 years. Just like 20 years ago, nobody foresaw this situation. Things do change. And while I'm not saying you should therefore sit back and just wait for them to change, I wouldn't despair. I wouldn't assume that everything will be the same in the future as it is now.
That's a very un-Jewish sentiment of yours, but
I told you I was a hopeful person. Yeah, I didn't say that things couldn't get worse. I just said they would change. But I do think that the political process has its own dynamic, its own personalities, and so on, and it may get less polarized. And by the way, Israel also has its own process and dynamic, and so I don't know what will happen. What I would say is, at the moment, since I think creating a third party is, and you'll tell me if you disagree, I think that it's a sort of pipe dream, even though I like the idea. We have to continue just to make a case to both sides that the extremes of their sides are not helpful. And in some cases, they're just flat wrong.
Well, I think, I mean, I'll just add a quick note to that, which is that, you know, as a former Republican, I experienced what I felt was a hostile takeover of the Republican Party by a guy named Donald Trump, whose views were sometimes in sympathy with the traditional Republican agenda, but very often not, fundamentally not, when it came to things like trade, NATO, commitments in the Middle East, a whole immigration, as a matter of fact, a whole slew of things that kind of the Ronald Reagan vision of the Republican Party stood for, and he he abandoned. So the Republican Party experienced a hostile takeover, which left, I think, an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. I wish that undercurrent were more vocally or courageously expressed, but there's no question that it's there. And I think the Democratic Party risks also a hostile takeover. It might have happened if Bernie Sanders, a guy who actually hadn't affiliated as a Democrat most of his career, had won the nomination, which he came very close to doing. I mean, it really hinged on what happened in South Carolina a little more than a year ago. Should that happen, you're also going to find a large, I think, group of very disaffected Democrats who might decide that they have more in common with the disaffected Republicans than they do with the extremes in both parties. And then something actually could happen, because these are people who believe, whatever their particular differences on taxes or this or that, they basically believe in the liberal world order, liberal in the old-fashioned sense of tolerant, open and so on. And so laying the groundwork for that kind of third party, which also understands that America has to be not just tolerant and pluralist, but a land that welcomes and celebrates excellence wherever it finds it, including among immigrants. That's a viable party, but we'll see. Let me turn to, there were a few questions from rabbis I noticed down here. Where did this go? Oh, okay. Rabbi Jacob Herber asks, there was a time when Torah united us, when Israel united us, when anti-Semitism united us. Today, this does not seem as evident. What do you think can be the glue that prevents us from atomizing altogether?
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure that there can be one thing that is going to be the coherent factor in the Jewish polity. Not right now. It may be that, like an organism, there have to be several different things in different configurations that tie Jews to one another. But it is, I mean, you can see the fracturing lines very clearly. Some of them are political and some of them are religious. But this is part of it is both part of the blessing and the corrosive nature of modernity, which is that it replaces a sense of obligation with a sense of freedom and choice. And therefore, people don't feel, I think, the same. I mean, Jewish law and American law, I teach a class to a bunch of lawyers periodically in my synagogue, and it's amazing how much Jewish law is animated by a sense of obligation and duty, and American law by a sense of freedom and unconstrained. And so when those two worldviews meet, it becomes more difficult to find that glue. I agree with you, although I would still say Torah, Israel, and anti-Semitism are at least the things that keep Jews arguing, and maybe arguing is the glue that holds Jews together, even as we fly apart, It may be that, in fact, contention is our glue.
Well, and I think you might add a fourth point, which is that the Achilles heel of modernity is a certain kind, I mean, you said freedom, but it's also a certain kind of aimlessness.
Yes.
It doesn't really provide resounding answers to the broad purposes of life, does it? It says, choose your own adventure, as the books I used to read as a boy had it. And choose your own adventure is great, but what I think people really want in their life is a sense of connectedness and meaning, right? That is offered in a few ways, but really not an infinite number of ways. So that the way that is essentially offered to you by virtue of being born a Jew is potentially a pretty attractive way and a pretty attractive answer to a liberal order that gives you perfect freedom, but establishes no coherent meaning. Because the other.
So, right. So I years ago, I wrote a very short book called Why Be Jewish? And basically it gave three answers. One was to join a people because feeling of connectedness. The second was to grow your soul. In other words, to become a more mature, developed human being. And the third was to seek God, which you can substitute if you don't like to seek God for some greater transcendent purpose. Exactly what you say. It's the Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning idea. And so if we want to put all of that, Torah, anti-Semitism, Israel, into a great contention, into a great package of meaning seeking, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And you now have your sermon for Shabbat.
Alan Franco, who I happen to know is in New Orleans and is a good friend of mine, asks, we are a people that tells stories, but not in 280 characters. If you could talk to Jack Dorsey, who some people may know is the founder and CEO of Twitter, to have him understand the extremes on his vehicle are causing great harm, what would you suggest?
I'm not sure. Well, I don't know that Jack Dorsey actually would be my chosen audience, because I don't think that you can change Twitter to allow storytelling while it is still Twitter. I think that the greater danger, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said, other people tell stories to put people to sleep. I tell all of my stories to make people wake up. And I think that there are stories in the Jewish tradition and stories of the Jewish tradition that would wake people, but they cannot, there's no way that you can adjust Twitter to make them tellable, if that's a phrase, unless it would be possible for him to create some adjunct that allows for greater storytelling. But the truth is that I think the way to do this, I mean, if I were given I'm given a wand and I have plenipotentiary power over all that money and all that whatever, I think the media is the way, much more powerful. What Roots did, for example, for the African-American community, I think you need similarly compelling, powerful storytelling about Jewish history and the Jewish story, in the way that Schindler's List did, but not comprehensive enough and not for this age. So that's what I would most look to, because I think that that's right now the way you reach most people most powerfully.
Well, if it were up to me to say something to Jack Dorsey, I would say shave and repent. But I don't know how far that would get me. We are nearly at the end of our hour, so I'm going to just thank you, Rabbi, for such a wide-ranging and consistently engaging and brilliant conversation. Nearly as brilliant as the essay
Nice.
that you wrote in Sapir, a journal of Jewish conversations, brought to you by the Maimonides Fund, which I have the honor of editing with my wonderful colleagues, Felicia Herman and Ariella Saperstein and Mark Cherendorf. And I want to thank you for joining in on this talk. We're going to do more of them because I think people are clearly hungry for these conversations. They're clearly worried about the fate of Jews and of Jews in the United States as well as in Israel. So we're going to do more of this, and we hope to do it at a high level, and to do it, and I use this word without quotation marks, to do it inclusively. We don't want people whose views aren't necessarily entirely consonant with our own to feel at all excluded. We want to reach out to every corner of the Jewish community, and to do so in a way that is deep and engaging and fun and always respectful. And David, you do that every single day of the week, which is why you're so beloved by your congregation and by so many people in the American and Israeli Jewish community. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Hope to see you in LA or New York or places in between. Thanks again.
Great.